Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight for our second webinar under the banner Solidarity Knows No Borders. My name is Maimouna and I'm an organizer with Migrants Organize. I'll be giving us a short intro tonight before handing over to colleagues for what we hope you will find an informative and thought-provoking discussion. We currently find ourselves in a context of growing far-right nationalism and attacks on migrants and those who support them. So it is more important than ever before for us to nurture and engage our communities to build our collective power. Migrant and BAME communities are facing accelerated attacks in the streets, in the media, and the structural racism of British state policies, from the hostile environment to the mass surveillance of Prevent. In light of this, we need to think about how we work locally and nationwide to build a movement that can confront the rise of far-right politics. To support these efforts, Migrants Organize has created a webinar series to foster discussion of the political strategies and tactics and how we work together to build a movement with the power to win. In our 2021 webinar series, we'll explore topics that impact our movement and our lives, from building power around elections to the histories and traditions of migrant and anti-racist organizing in Britain, to legal challenges and movement building. Join us to discuss how we can win justice for our communities and demand dignity, welcome, justice, and action. This series is part of our wider work, laying the groundwork for a migrant justice movement, which you can look at and add your name to by going to the Firm Charter website, which we will share a link to now in the chat. So without further ado, I'll hand over to my colleague Akram to start us off today.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Really wonderful to be on the call with you. My name is Akram. I'm the campaigns officer at Migrants Organize, and I'm chairing today's event. So for today's webinar, we've got a really brilliant list of speakers whose political work and research has really important lessons for our organizing work today. The purpose of today's discussion will be to increase our understanding of you and to think upon hearing the speakers, what are the strategies, ideas, tactics, and political practices that are relevant for us now and that can inform how we take forward this fight. With this in mind, I want to introduce tonight's speakers, who will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes each. I also have the unenviable task of trying to keep things down to an hour and a half so that we can get time for questions also at the end. If anyone has a question, you can just pop it in the box, in the comment box on Zoom at any time throughout the discussion, and colleagues at Migrants Organize or other people on the panel or whoever can either respond or join the discussion. And then at the end, we'll be taking some questions from there and putting them to the speakers directly. So you can just do that at any time throughout the talk. If the questions are directed at any particular speaker, then do let us know that. So our first speaker for this evening is Sundari Anitha. Anitha is a professor of gender, violence and work at the School of Social and Political Sciences, University of Lincoln, UK. And her research lies in two areas: the problem of violence against women and girls, and gender, race and ethnicity in employment relations. She's published widely on both of these areas. This includes a co-authored book, Striking Women, and a website with educational resources for migration, gender and work, which should be in the chat now. Anitha has also previously managed a women's aid refuge and is a trustee of Asha Project, which is a specialist refuge for South Asian women who've experienced domestic violence. And this evening she'll be speaking about the history of the Grunwick strike, I believe. Yeah, over to you, Anitha.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. That's quite an impressive number of speakers and audience. So I think Zoom talks are taking off. We're getting used to the lockdown now. Today, I want to talk to you about the Grunwick dispute. Some of you may be familiar with it. For others, it might be the first time you're hearing about it. The Grunwick dispute was a strike that was led by South Asian women in the late 70s. And a tiny bit about the background. So this was a period it came following a long period when workers, migrant workers, women workers, had been engaged in a whole range of disputes with their employers to secure better rights. And what they found time and time again is that every time there were differential pay, there was differential pay on the basis of gender and or on the basis of race and gender. They found they not only had to fight their employers, they also had to fight for a voice within their trade unions and in the face of resistance from their co-workers. So this was a history of organizing that was met with a resistance from their trade union and the employers. So Grunwick dispute is remembered as the first time in the UK when a majority of trade unions, at least for a period, gave wholehearted support to migrant women workers. So Grunwick was a factory which produced, which processed photographs in North London. So this was a time before digital cameras, and 70s was a time when foreign holidays began. People began going on foreign holidays, and they come back with those little rules. I don't know if you remember, some of you are probably too young to do that. Those rolls of film, and you took your photographs in the holidays and you posted it off, and then you got those pictures back in the post. And Grunwick was a factory which processed those photographs, and they were primarily comprised of white workers and a small section of Caribbean workers. Then in early 70s, mid 70s, there was this whole new group of migrants who came to the UK, and these were migrants from Africa, so South Asian origin migrants from countries in Africa. And they had gone to those countries as part of the colonial regime. They were the middle tier, the middling rank in the colonial hierarchy, where the native blacks were at the bottom and the Asians came from, so they came from India and they did the administrative work of the colonial regime, and the whites were at the top. So this was their location. So they were well off, fairly well off, middle class, engaged in business and trade in those countries, had a lot of economic clout there. But those countries, when they became independent, those which I completely can understand, they wanted to claw back some of those advantages which had been given to those Indians who had migrated there as part of the colonial system. And these so African Asians, as we call them, had British passports, and they came to the UK. And as migrants organize, will in your work you find it again and again, all of you will know, with every new category of migrants who come to the UK, they are positioned at the bottom of the labor market. Doesn't matter what background they came from, doesn't matter what skills they possessed, because those skills are not valued here. They become this workforce which is seen as exploitable, or the flip side of the same thing is they're constructed as good workers. What that means is they're workers who are exploitable, who are presumed to be passive because they're not aware of trade union rights, or they may not know have a history of organizing in the UK. So these were the very same assumptions which were attached to these women workers. And indeed, many of them had never worked outside the home before. They were from middle-class families, and those who had worked outside the home had worked in respectable jobs. So as secretaries, as teachers, they had never worked in factories, because this is their class position was very different before they came here. So Grunwick factory gradually began putting leaflets out saying, we welcome people like you here, and the workforce shifted massively over a very short period of time to predominantly South Asian. And these workers were paid less than other factories who processed photographs at that time. But the key question was one which migrants organized is still agitating about, struggling for, was the issue of dignity in the workplace, of respect, dignity. So it wasn't just about wages, equal wages. That was a key part of the debate, but it was also about how they were treated. So like Nancy Fraser says, it wasn't just about redistribution. So it wasn't just about material advantages, which are very important. It was also about recognition, how you're treated. And so these workers found, women workers, that they were treated with disrespect. There were on one hand, there were systems in place to make them extract as much work as possible from them. So there was a list of good workers. There was this big list on that factory floor, and they would scratch names, put them at the bottom of that list. And if your name was at the bottom, then there was always a threat that you could be sacked. So there's this fear people worked with. There were also very short notice overtimes for women workers. So in the evening, they'd suddenly be told during the peak period in the summer, they'd have to stay back till 10 o'clock because there were lots of photographs to be processed. And we all know that women do a second shift. They don't just work outside the home, they come home and they have to do the bulk of housework. So for these women workers, it was really hard to have this overtime at very short notice. And then there were issues of indignity, how they were treated. So women workers had to put their hand up and ask to go to the toilet. And we all know that there are very gendered constructions of our bodily needs. So Trump, for instance, used to think that with Hillary Clinton, when he talked about any women, if he talked about women needing to urinate, it was disgusting as far as he was concerned. But for men, it was fine. It was normal. That was okay for men. And you see it everywhere. I mean, you can in the park when you go around, you see men behind trees, and it's frowned upon, but it's acceptable. You would never see women relieving themselves behind a tree. So there's this whole gendered assumptions about our bodily needs that the managers played upon. So they made the women raise their hands to ask to go to the toilet, and the women felt ashamed. And there's also, there isn't just the gender dimension, the managers were white men. And so women didn't feel they could ask them, and their visits to the toilets were timed. So a whole range of conditions which were really oppressive. And these conditions were oppressive partly because they were migrant workers, and management felt they could get away with it. So one day, there were some student workers in the factory. In the summer peak period, they needed extra workers, and often these workers would be relatives of people who were working there, often students who were in university. So these families, middle-class families, had children who were starting to go to universities. So one day, Jabin Desai, one of the workers there, her son was working there in the summer, and he was chatting to his friends as he was on the conveyor belt doing his work. He was laughing, giggling, as young people do. The manager turned to him and said, "Stop chattering like monkeys. This is not a zoo." And we all know, again, what the term monkeys means, and these associations with Black people, with non-white people, of animalism. This whole associations there's a long history of that. Jabin Desai was really unhappy about it. Later that day, as she was going home, the manager stopped her and said she'd have to do overtime. And she was mindful of a long journey home that awaited her, the dinner that had to be made. She was quite angry. They had angry words with the manager. She turned to the manager and said, "Let me tell you something. What you're running here is not a factory. It is a zoo. In a zoo, you have many types of animals. You have monkeys who dance to your tune. You also have lions who can bite your head off. We are the lions, Mr. Manager. I've had enough." She said, "I want my freedom." And she walked out. And as she walked out, she turned to the other workers and said, "This man wouldn't treat white workers the way he treats us." So she was very clear that this was about race. It was about gender. It was also about race. They walked out, joined a trade union. And over the next few months, it was a very quiet picket line. And then they began going, the trade union supported them. They began going to other factories, talking about their issues, trying to get support from other factories, other workers. And over the course of the next few months, they gained support from a range of other workers, partly because their struggle was framed as a struggle for union recognition. And the next summer of 77, thousands of workers joined them on picket lines in the narrow streets of North London. There were sometimes 20,000 people supporting them. And this was massively significant because just a decade earlier, when Enoch Powell made his Reverse of Blood speech, the dock workers union had marched to the parliament with their banner, the shop stewards with their banner, demanding an end to immigration. And just a decade later, at the Grunwick dispute, on one of the days of mass pickets, among the 20,000 ordinary people who were there were the same dock workers union with their banner demanding rights for these migrant women workers. And for me, that's a really important moment to remember, because it feels like we're in a similar place now, where migrant workers have been pitted against what are seen as indigenous workers. And so the whole Brexit debate was about that. So from a place like that in the late 60s, it was possible for British working class, for white working class, to see a common cause with migrant and women workers. And that's what, that's the struggle we have now. That's what we need to recapture. To a long story, ins and out of the Grunwick dispute, I'm not, you can look that up on our website. Eventually, the Labour government had a wafer-thin majority. They put pressure on the trade unions because this dispute was in the front pages of the newspapers, and it was policed in a very repressive way. The Special Patrol Group were out in full force, rehearsing at the Grunwick dispute tactics that they would then try out in the miners' dispute. Labour Party put pressure, and the trade union withdrew their support. And eventually, the strike ended without success. And part of this pressure that the trade unions put on them was to bureaucratize the dispute. So to shift from mass solidarity and public action to inquiries, to ACAS, to mediation. And that, I think, is again an important lesson, in that it's solidarity that works for people who are at the margins. It's that end to solidarity, end to mass picketing, that led to the demise of the Grunwick dispute. And the moment when it seemed that they might have won was when they had the backing of a mass of ordinary people behind them. And that's something that we need to think about how we capture. In terms of, I think I'm running out of time, legacy of the Grunwick dispute, it's part of a broader political climate that we're talking about now, in terms of shifting how we perceive the working class, and how we see a common cause between different groups of workers. It's also about thinking of how we might organize better. For Grunwick workers, they went to different factories, got different groups of workers to join them in solidarity action, and that's become very difficult now because of the legislation. Margaret Thatcher brought in changes to solidarity picketing. So some of those kinds of actions have become more difficult now. But what is possible now is more of solidarity through community activism, through community unionism. And we can see that in disputes that have been won recently, like the cleaners' struggles in SOAS, where other categories of, so it wasn't just about the trade union, it wasn't just about the workers. Workers built solidarity with students and with staff at SOAS. And those kinds of solidarities, I think, within local communities that need to be forged in order to think about how the struggle for migrants' rights might be perceived as a struggle for on behalf of the community as a whole. And that's the way forward, I see. I am going to stop here. If you're interested, we have I've got a website, a link to which was put somewhere there. And as part of this project, we've also produced a comic, Striking Women, to take the story of this dispute to ordinary people. Because when we were doing our research, we found out that there was very little knowledge of this dispute outside the trade unions. And in fact, one of the women that I interviewed, a striker, she herself didn't know that Grunwick had become this big moment in labor history. She'd just gone on, done her work. She didn't know that lots of people look up to Grunwick dispute. And when I spoke to her, when I went to interview her, she said, "Oh, my grandson was so excited today. He said, someone's coming to interview you. Why?" And she told her grandson about all this. And he said, "I can't believe it, Grandma, you went on strike. You did something that someone wants to know about." And later on, he went on to do a school project on the Grunwick dispute. And that really made me think that even the people who are at the very heart of this haven't claimed it as part of their history. And it's really important to remember these struggles, because in many ways, the contribution of migrants to rights, to labor rights, to rights that all of us enjoy, has been erased. And if you think of the Black History Month, all of that, it's become about culture, it's become about identity and celebrating. It's become very depoliticized. And I think part of our project was also to capture that history and that politics of struggle, which is really important to remember and celebrate. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anitha. Actually, I was wondering, there was a question for you because you had a few minutes left. There's a question for you that I thought maybe you want to maybe take on now, which is in the chat. So it's from Maya, who says, "Hi, question for Dr. Sundari Anitha. You have some pieces in your writing on Grunwick to talk about the initial participation of Afro-Caribbean and other Black non-Asian women alongside South Asian descent women, but that was erased in part in the media. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about this, perhaps. Thank you.
Yeah, so we saw images when we began our research. We saw images from documentaries which had where we noticed that there were Caribbean workers there on the early picket lines, and we searched long and hard for those workers. We knocked door to door around the factory to try and find this group of workers, and we simply could not find them. And part of it was also, I think, the reason why they're not visible in the later part of the dispute was perhaps also because of class background. So the Grunwick strikers were from middle class backgrounds. They came to the UK as entire family units, and therefore they had a level of security in that when the worker who was at the factory, usually in most cases the women worker, lost their jobs, there were other members of their extended family who were working, and therefore the pressure to find another job was not similar on them as it might have been on Caribbean workers. So we've thought a lot about why were they not visible in later parts of this dispute. So as the dispute dragged on, and it took a long time before they got the strike pay, that was the period in which those group of workers disappeared, probably because they had to find a job. They didn't have whole family units that they were nestled within, where one person could afford not to have a job. And we tried hard to locate those workers. I'd still be happy to have, if anyone knows any relatives who were in the Grunwick dispute, Black workers, I'd be happy to talk to them, but we simply couldn't find them. And so again, within an erasure, there's another erasure there.
Thanks so much, Anitha. I think we're going to move to our next speaker now, which is Dr. Catherine Median. She's a lecturer in sociology at the Open University, whose research focuses on work on historical struggles for reproductive rights and the present-day effects of immigration controls, policing, and health inequalities on migrant and non-white communities in Britain. Catherine's research has been incredibly insightful to especially us as an organization and others who've been working on migrant access to health. And some of you may have seen the talk that Catherine gave on the international struggle for healthcare, which was a seminar which we held in November to launch a report, which I think the link to that will be put in the chat now. And yeah, today she'll be talking to us about previous examples of the hostile environment and the context in which they were introduced, and the strategies, language, and connections, many of those used while confronting these policies. And again, this is returning to the themes that Anitha was describing now about the Grunwick strike, about what do we take from these struggles and what are the strategies, ideas, and ways that we can, of approaching it, that we can utilize today. So yeah, over to you, Catherine. Thank you.
Hi, yeah, thank you. Yeah, so thank you for the invitation, and it's great to see so many people here. So as Akram said, I'm a lecturer in sociology at the Open University, and over the past year, I've been, well, about a year and a half, I've been looking at the kind of history of internal border controls within Britain and elsewhere, and I'm particularly interested in how they kind of arose, how they were resisted. And as Akram said, like, I've looked at borders within healthcare and earlier iterations of migrant charges for healthcare, passport checks within the NHS. I'm not going to talk about any of that today, but I think the link is in the chat if anyone was interested in learning more about that. And you're always welcome to contact me. I'm going to share my screen because I've got some like pictures to show you as I'm talking. Hopefully you can see that. Okay, so as I said, I've been looking at the kind of history of internal border controls within Britain and elsewhere and what we might learn from that today. And from the research that I've been doing, it's become increasingly clear that what we're today calling the hostile environment is not a new phenomenon. And framing it as such is actually erasing a lot of these older policy precedents and legacies of anti-racist struggle in Britain. And this also has social, sort of consequences for the social justice calls that we're making today. So, for example, if our call today is to abolish the hostile environment, then I think my work suggests that actually that's going to leave a lot of policy and legal precedents intact that do a lot of the same work. So I'm going to delve into kind of take you on a bit of a whistle-stop tour of kind of border controls within 1980s Britain. I'm going to talk a bit about what borders look like, how they were resisted, and I'm going to talk about one or two groups in particular. So I'm looking at how other groups who were resisting internal borders doing work that's quite similar to the Patients Not Passports campaign today and Migrants Organise. I'm going to suggest that these older groups have a way of kind of comprehending internal border controls and welfare access restriction that doesn't rely on nationalism, which is something we're increasingly seeing in how resistance is getting framed, but instead helps us understand hostile borders here in relation to regimes of control and surveillance elsewhere. And in that way, it's kind of an anti-colonial and anti-imperial critique. So I'll provide a bit of policy context, I'll talk about the campaigns, and then I'll just sort of make some suggestions about what we might take from this today. So just a little bit of context, you're probably all familiar with this, so I'll keep it brief. But in 1981, the UK government passed the Nationality Act, which came into force in 1983, and this built on earlier immigration and nationality acts from 68, 71 and others, and it reclassified citizenship in Britain, the category of citizenship of the United Kingdom and colonies, into these three new categories: British citizenship, British dependent territory citizenship, and British overseas citizenship. So in effect, the Act sought to remove formerly colonised populations from the category of British citizenship and define citizenship through lines of descent to this island, and thus characterised belonging in Britain around lines of race. So in defining citizenship through lines of descent to Britain, the Act sought to legally cement the idea that to be British was to be white. And this is a really important moment in the history of internal border controls within Britain, because if British services are for British citizens and citizenship is defined in a way that excludes racialised people, then they need to carry out checks to ensure that these so-called foreigners aren't accessing services to which they're not entitled. So in tandem with this Act, a whole regime of passport controls emerges and racial profiling within the NHS, social security, housing, schools, colleges, universities, and in collaboration with the police and the Home Office. Just a few examples of this are the introduction of charges and passport checks for migrant healthcare in 1982 that I mentioned, and both the Social Security Act of 1980 and the 1985 Housing Act, which both stipulated for the first time that migrants needed to be maintained without recourse to public funds, which then obviously had an effect on leading to the refusal of benefit for thousands of migrants, many of whom had been here for a long time but hadn't acquired this new citizenship. So following this Act, or around this time, a number of groups arose to resist internal passport checks, and these include, but are not limited to at all, there's so many, Smash the Racist Checks, No Racist Checks campaign, which was actually based in Peckham, and it was specifically a campaign around racist classification in Peckham Dole Office. A group that I'll talk a bit more about, No Pass Laws Here, and these are just some of the groups that specifically arose in response to internal border controls. But it's important to say that the 1981 Nationality Act was felt much more widely, and some of the repercussions include, for example, the 1981 Brixton riots, which saw Brixton's black community rise up against police brutality, mass unemployment, and structural and institutional racism. And I'll come back to some of these links between organising against the police and organising against borders a bit later. But it's just to say that we shouldn't be seeing these struggles as separate, right? The kind of call to dismantle the police force or to abolish the police has to be thought in tandem with the abolition of borders. So I'll talk about No Pass Laws Here, who I just mentioned. They emerged as a coalition around the time of the Nationality Act between migrant organisations, welfare action groups, law centres and other community organisations. For example, the African Refugee Housing Action Group, Oldham Law Centre, Greenwich Welfare Rights, Lambeth Welfare Rights, Paddington Law Centre, Islington Law Centre, among many others. And they emerged in London. They were also somewhat active in the Midlands, and they had a corresponding group called No Pass Laws in the North West campaign that was based in Manchester. And so together they sought to document and challenge the increasing internal activities of the Immigration Service and the growing array of informal and formal policies that were requiring racialised people to show their passports in order to access welfare and employment. So they produced a leaflet in I think it was early 1981 when they were founded, and I'm going to read you a little excerpt. No Pass Laws here is a slogan of a campaign being mounted by several organisations. We want to demonstrate and expose the extent of immigration control. We want to campaign against the introduction of new controls and for the abolition of existing controls. Internal immigration controls are spreading throughout national and local agencies of the state. More and more central and local government departments are becoming immigration watchdogs for the Home Office. The No Pass Laws Here group are collecting instances of increasing amounts of surveillance, control and harassment of immigrant and Black residents in Britain, passport raids at workplaces and homes, passport inspections for jobs, local authority housing, health treatment, education and bank accounts, extensive questioning by registrars of marriage, for social security assistance when requesting police assistance, if convicted of offences and in seeking to satisfy the provision of the Nationality Act of 1981. So what I've just read to anyone who's tracking, following or interested in the hostile environment sounds remarkably familiar to the kinds of internal borders that we're facing today. So in seeking to challenge and ultimately abolish internal border controls, the No Pass Laws Here group produced regular bulletins and newsletters that documented cases of internal control in education, housing, social security, healthcare, workplaces and banks. And they also translated information leaflets about policy changes. They held workshops and conferences. And some of the people that I've been speaking to who were involved sort of really talked about their work with law centres, and they really supported or were working alongside people who were challenging individual cases of benefit refusal. They also publicised protests and days of action and publicised individual deportation campaigns. And they took their name from the pass law system of apartheid South Africa. And throughout their work, they did a number of things that I think are quite important. They pointed to the increase in data sharing between government departments and the Home Office, as well as the police and the Home Office. They argued that internal borders sought to undermine the rights of all racialised people in the UK because anybody who looked or sounded foreign was liable for questioning. They highlighted the specific ways in which migrant women were being subjectified by internal borders through being responsible for reproductive care and labour. They were often being placed on the front line. They called out unions who were collaborating with immigrant enforcement, and they importantly drew attention to the way in which border controls within the welfare state are the direct result of state racism. They create a colour bar through the working class and they divide workers. They create categories of deserving and undeserving benefit recipients, right? So you kind of get this kind of the active creation of this toxic category of the white working class who are entitled to certain services and benefits while you're also creating a colour bar which is denying access to racialised people. So before I go into a bit more detail, what's happening? I want to talk a bit more about their framing. So as I said, No Pass Laws Here, they take their name from the pass law system of apartheid South Africa, a system that required Black workers or all workers who were racialised under apartheid to carry passes with them at all times in order to access land, services and employment. So essentially, it sought to maintain racial segregation and dispossession within a white supremacist state, while also securing the provision of cheap Black labour. So in short, it's a system of racialised capitalism. Understanding internal passport controls here as not identical to, but as operating through these kind of colonial and racist logics, as the apartheid pass law system, the group drew links between internal controls here and those elsewhere. And this is a really important framing in the context of the Nationality Act, because if we understand internal border controls to be part of a larger state project that is stripping citizenship from formerly colonised populations and barring them from accessing the welfare state, which was historically funded with the money taken from colonial projects, then anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism become really important frameworks within which to resist internal borders in post-colonial Britain. And I would say that still remains a really crucial framing. So using this kind of idea of no pass laws, the group sought to challenge internal borders. And one way that they did this was disseminating bulletins like the one you can see. which detailed various changes in welfare rules, individual cases and informations about passport raids, and just kind of analyses of what was going on. So this is an October 1982 bulletin where they documented the increasing role that borders played in the workplace, and they showed that passport controls had been introduced when applying for national insurance numbers, which was new, and they detailed how workplaces were increasingly asking for passports before making offers of employment, which is something that we totally take for granted today, like you need to show your passport to get a job, but it wasn't always the case. In March 1982, they detailed the Social Security Act that I mentioned earlier of 1980, which included for the first time this notion that benefit could be withheld if people did not have recourse to public funds. And they were sort of documenting how this was leading to the refusal of benefits to certain groups. And in 1983, they were raising concerns about the role of computers in facilitating data sharing between the police, the immigration service and welfare departments, which of course is another key concern today under the hostile environment. And alongside their bulletins, they also created information leaflets targeted at different areas of welfare or to different migrant populations, sort of providing know your rights style advice. And these were also translated into several languages. And something that I think is also really important is that their framing of pass laws allowed them to understand internal borders here and their resistance to them in relation to other regimes of surveillance and control. And these are just a few snippets of information I found actually at the Institute of Race Relations where Colin is based. So they were corresponding with groups like the UK-based Azania Solidarity Group, who invited them in this letter to speak alongside the ANC, the African National Congress, the PAC, the Pan-African Congress, and the BCMA, the Black Consciousness Movement, to talk about and draw out the connections between what was happening here and what was happening in South Africa. And in addition, it's really important to say that this term pass laws wasn't exclusively used by this group. I think they're one of the only groups that probably had it as their title, but it was very common in anti-racist organising at the time. There's loads of examples of this, particularly in Sivanandan's work, but one I'm particularly interested in, the links that groups who were campaigning against police brutality were also using this language that kind of created this shared understanding of both their plight and resistance to it. So this is an example from the 1982 Newham Defence Campaign. In September 1982, 8 South Asian youths were arrested for defending themselves and their community from racist attacks, and they were charged with conspiracy. So what happened was that there was ongoing attacks against Asian school children in Newham. Children were walking to school, they were getting beaten up by white mobs. So this defence campaign, a patrol got put together of young South Asian men who were walking the kids to school to protect them. And one day they got ambushed, the men, by some plainclothes police officers who beat them up and arrested them. So in response, this defence campaign came about, which was raising money for their legal defence and campaigning against the conspiracy charges. And I'll just read you a little bit of this leaflet, which really could have been written yesterday. We have seen both Labour and Tory governments bringing in racist immigration controls on Black people, making us the scapegoats for the present economic crisis. On top of continual racist attacks and police harassment, Black people have to contend with racist and sexist immigration laws which keep our families divided and question our existence in this country. Internal passport checks, a pass law system, deportations, fire bombings, and physical attacks are daily reality for Black people in Britain. It's in this context of this history of racism, both physical and institutional, that the case of the Newham 8 must be seen. By charging 8 youths with conspiracy, the state is challenging our very right to organise and defend ourselves against racist violence to survive in this society. So why am I sharing all of this, or what do I think it might offer us today? Well, besides offering us like an expansive archive of the history of internal borders in Britain, which I think is really important in this moment, it offers us a case history to help us make sense of how populations have been sorted and targeted by racist and racializing state apparatus. Looking back from today's hostile environment, it demonstrates the endurance of racialized internal passport controls over time, and it points to how they've long been used to regulate access to employment, welfare, and daily life in Britain. A key difference today is that many of the regulations are statutory duties, and they're often applied on, back then they weren't always statutory duties, which meant they could be applied unevenly. And it made regional wins possible, and it made the reversal of individual decisions easier. But I nonetheless think that we may take a few things from this archive, particularly their anti-nationalism, their refusal to romanticise the welfare state, the connections that they drew between police brutality and pass laws, and their understanding that internal passport controls function to create this toxic category of the white working class by dividing workers. So in revisiting this call and this demand, no pass laws here, I was always reminded to kind of refuse this newness, right? The newness of the hostile environment. What does it mean to do that? And to continue to build on these legacies that demand nothing short than the abolition, both here and elsewhere, of internal regimes of state racism. And I'll leave you with this 1982 quote by them. The effect of this system of internal immigration control is to place whole sections of the Black community under surveillance. On top of this, the no recourse to public funds criteria in the immigration rules treats them as gatecrashers on the welfare state. Ultimately, internal immigration control is a threat to the right of Black people to live in this country at all, because everyone who is Black, whether they are subject to immigration control or not, knows that their right to be here is questioned whenever they are asked about their place of origin, nationality, immigration status, or to produce a passport as proof of any of these. In short, it's a system of pass laws. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Catherine. That was a really wonderful presentation. And again, really clear on some of the things that we might take from it for our organising today. So our next speaker is Colin Prescod, who is a sociologist turned cultural animator who's worked in film, TV and theatre, as well as in academia. He's a chair of the Institute for Race Relations, as Catherine just mentioned, and he's also a member of the editorial working committee of the international journal Race and Class, which is housed at the Institute for Race Relations. Also, those of us living and working in North Kensington will know about Colin's long-standing engagement with many of the campaigns and initiatives that happen in the neighbourhood in which Migrants Organise is based, that are being built locally against gentrification, social cleansing, police violence and racism. And so Colin today is going to be speaking about his experience in that context, in organising and his experience of that and some of the lessons that we might have in our struggles today. Over to you, Colin. I think you're on mute. Colin, you're on mute, I'm afraid.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Akram. Quickly, I'm mumbling because I'm saying I'm going to challenge. I have to correct you. Institute of Race Relations, not Institute for Race Relations. You said several times for relations. Hello, everybody. Coming after those two clearly informative presentations, they were brilliant. There's hardly anything else for me to say, but I did write down something to say. Those of you who were listening to those first two presentations will find echoes of things that you've already heard from Catherine and from who else spoke? Oh yes, from Anitha. Okay, let me hurry through this. What can I bring to this webinar forum and to its main aim of informing struggles for rights and justice? I want to focus a bit on who we are and what we are, we migrants, as we're called, or what we represent. Because in a way, the label migrants is given to us by the state, and it isn't a label we would choose necessarily to use to describe who we are and what we are and what we represent. I want to come at our story from a slightly different position. I want to look at us more expansively than just as migrants. You will see already that I'm referring to things that you've just heard from Catherine. You've seen that I'm referring to things that you've heard already from Anitha in their presentations. If I have to use the term migrant these days, sociologically speaking, I go for adjusting it to say migrant settlers, because this term raises the interesting question of when does a migrant cease to be a migrant? For some of us, the label seems to stick for generations and generations. And the fact that the label sticks means that our status always has a kind of question mark attached. This will not surprise you if you've just listened to Catherine. Okay, In the mid-1950s, just to ground myself with you, my mother came to Britain from a place called Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean. And a few years later, she brought me here in the late 1950s. So my mother and I were migrants. Migrants, I have found, organize. Migrants organize because they have to, in the main, always organize to ask for full citizens' rights, which are not delivered willingly to us. We find that we have to make a fuss, complaints, campaigns, demonstrations, sometimes riots, protest movements, self-help organizations in pursuit of our full citizens' rights. We build militant communities in order to obtain our rights. I've come to think of all these as this aspect of our struggle as our struggles for us to belong. Yeah, our struggles, we call them all the time. Struggles for what? Struggles to belong. And very similar narratives, stories of struggles to belong, are repeated in many parts of Britain, the country that we now live in. South, Midlands, North, everywhere you look, migrants have had to make the same kinds of struggles, something we have to remember. So your current Migrants Organize, that I'm speaking into organization story, is part of a bigger, older story of how cities, nations, and histories are made. My Appa, the brilliant activist, intellectual, Sivanandan, left us a phrase which he popularized, a phrase which any of us might want to answer with this in this way when asked by the immigration officers, why are you here? The phrase is, we are here because you were there. At first sight, it's a glib, kind of smart-assed phrase, but the more you think about it, the more you realize how much it's a biting statement of a response to why are we here. Because at the time when he would have invented it back in the 60s, 70s, when he used it in speeches and writing, Sivanandan would have been talking to, in the main, people who were from the Southeast Asia, from Africa maybe, and a lot of us from the Caribbean. And what we first felt when we heard that were coming from, all of us, came from histories of colonialism, histories of imperialism. We were united by that. Black was our political culture that came out of our experience in that kind of way. So when he's made that saying, we are here because you were there, as an answer to the immigration officer who says, why are you here? It bit immediately. The point is, though, that it actually bites today as well, because that notion of being there, of imperialism being there, of colonialism being there, continues to this day through the influence of finance, the big finance corporations, the big manufacturing corporations, the big mining corporations, the big corporations that sell defense weaponry, that makes wars in the places that we come from. All of these things, but that support governments that oppress us. All of these things make it necessary, make the circumstances out of which we run, we move in order to come to places like this, that makes us, if you like, migrants. Most of us belong to histories heavily influenced by these imperialists, histories that have contributed to wealth, to the wealth of these places, to which we've now moved. And now today, I see us as making, not only arriving here fleeing, so to speak, those awful conditions often, but making vital interventions and contributions to these very societies. I see us as bringing changes for the better to these places. You already heard Anitha effectively begin to talk about that, I think, or was it Catherine? Bringing these old imperialist societies in a way up to date, so to speak, bringing the new real world to those who would dwell in the old. The matters that we've drawn attention to in our struggles as migrants, as settlers, as migrant settlers here, are matters that needed to be addressed for the entire society. It's a commonplace to observe that now. Migrants also, it seems to me, make community with other communities that we find here of migration and settlement, with migrant settlers, other migrant settlers. In the 1950s and 60s, and 70s, when my mother came here and I followed her, Caribbeans meet here other Caribbeans for the first time. Trinidadians and Jamaicans from different ends of the Caribbean meet each other to make community. We meet for the first time these people who were descendants of enslaved Africans in the Caribbean, meet for the first time in large groups in fully living ways, continental Africans. We meet South Asians. If you're from Trinidad in the Caribbean, you might have known some Indian people and Muslim people and so on in your culture. But for most of the Caribbean, you wouldn't have met many of these people before. We also meet Irish migrants in this place. So our migration story is an ever-changing, challenging story with ever-changing struggles for citizens' rights and for the rights to participate and contribute in these cultures, in these societies, for the right to change Britain, I'm arguing, for the right to fully belong. That's my contention. Let me talk a little bit more about my migrant settler story. We, my mother's generation, arrive as West Indians or Caribbeans, not as migrants. Migrants is a state label, I repeat, imposed by the state, by the state's information office, our immigration officers. Many of us think we've come to work, to make a contribution to the society that we're coming to, and to live for just a while, perhaps a few years, hoping to save some money, as well as to send some back home, and eventually to return ourselves, we think, when we first arrive. We gradually, reluctantly realize that the stay has to be a longer one. We may have to settle here, or a bit, living a bit like with one foot here and one foot there. Then finally, many or most of us begin to realize that this has become our home, our yard, as we say in the Caribbean. This is challenging for us, challenging stuff, and challenging for many of our new country people, challenging for their old country with its old ideas of itself. This is an all interesting and exciting stuff, all of this in truth. Although it too often gets overwhelmed by the negative experiences of rejection, injustice, unfairness, personal attacks, and nastiness. We also connect here, it's important for us to realize, with residents who treat us fairly and with humanity. I think you've already heard Catherine in a way referring to some of that, from their own traditions. Amongst the people that we meet in our new places, there are people who have recent living memories of how and when they came as migrants, Poles, Irish people, and so on. And there are other people connected to humanitarian religious practices and or political and intellectual traditions who behave in welcoming ways to us, who help us to settle, who join our struggles for equal rights and justice, who build community supports with us. Amongst them are professionals and social and community workers and political activists of the people. These are amongst the hundreds, I remember as a boy in 1959, these people who were not us, who were here when we arrived, were amongst the hundreds of people who attended, in a wonderful photographs that exist, the funeral of a guy called Kelso Cochrane, who was killed in 1959, where I live. I mean, for those of you who are, I don't know where you are, the people who are taking part in this webinar, I'm in North Kensington. Where I live now, in 1958, I arrived here into riots. They were called race riots. They were the result of people attacking us on the street, attacking Black people on the street and so on. And in 1959, months after the peak of those riots in 58, a man called Kelso Cochrane was killed. Killed very much like Stephen Lawrence was killed many decades later in London. I'm pointing just now here, I'm not going to tell a whole of that story, but the point is that at the funeral for this man, that it was attended by hundreds and hundreds of Black people, Caribbeans, but also by hundreds and hundreds, I mean, there were thousands of people there, of white people, of people from here. So I'm talking immediately about how we build community. Our communities, we often, when we say communities, we're talking mainly about the people who look like us, who arrived at the same time as we, who are just settling. But in fact, our communities consist of people who are us and people who come to join us, who come to support these communities. I think when we talk about community support, we should be aware that we're talking about that. Both Anita and Catherine have talked about that sense of the community being the support. That's actually where I'm arriving at in all the little bit that I'm trying to say here today. We're interested in recruiting the assistance of these friendly people. We make community with them. They are and become vital go-betweens often and supporters in our engagements with the state, local and national. When we build our self-help organizations, we include the assistance they can bring to the things that we're trying to organize for ourselves independently of the state, to provide advice and information about obtaining rights which are denied us in the workplace, in schools, in police stations, in law courts, in public places, in gaining access to housing, and so on. And there are always some native locals who have assisted us in making community with us in these struggles. In North Kensington from the 1960s until the 1980s, there are any number of self-help organizations which emerged in this kind of way. The Mangrove is recently one which has been publicized because there's been a film on television about it, but there are others, Blackfields Information Center, Grassroots, Unity Association, and so on. We find that we have to organize in the face of all those difficult and all that bad stuff, and we grow to ourselves. It's a kind of, I'm trying to get to the end of what I'm saying. It's a kind of journey that I think we're on, yes, really. First, there's the physical journey to this new place. Then there's the journey to belonging, which challenges our new society and which challenges us as well. We also have adjustments to make in this journey. One aspect of these challenges is hardly ever talked about. I'm just going to mention it almost in passing here, explicitly now organizing, partly because we don't have the language for it. And that is the challenge of dealing with displacement. The people called migrants actually could also be called people who are displaced. We are displaced people for all sorts of reasons. This is a mental and psychological challenge, it seems to me, that we have to handle. And it is often tied up in misunderstandings that confuse and complicate our dealings with others in our new communities. It's worth remembering this as you are thinking about how we organize. I'll say no more of that just now, but just let you know. I think you all know what I'm referring to. Then to go back to a little bit to my story, my personal migrant story. Later on in our migrant settler journeys, we come to realize something else, something bigger and deeper that underlies our everyday challenges, something which looks and feels like deliberate prejudice and repeated and insistent unfair discrimination. One big word for it coming out of my story is racism. We'd known it before in colonial times. And where this is not just about name-calling racism or explicit personal animosity and aggression and personal attacks, a bigger phrase for what this thing has come to be institutional racism. And this is about prejudice, discrimination, and unfairness, which lies in how the authorities treat us, how the national state and the local state and the agents and offices of the state and the big media, which in the main express the will of the authorities, how all these things finish up treating us unfairly. To return to my particular story, I hope I'm not running too far over time, my particular migrant story, I'm afraid that the struggle continues. The struggle, the need to organize becomes necessary over many generations, essentially because unfair institutional discrimination and disadvantage continues, underscored by state action as well as state inaction. So we've had in our present era the obscene injustice of what's been called the Windrush scandal. See what I mean about the fact that some migrants seem to remain migrants forever. Yes, it's a term that sticks. We've had the Windrush scandal, as it's called recently, visited by the state on people who arrived here from the Caribbean as far back as the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, when my mother came, who are being harassed now, persecuted, and even expelled from the country, falsely charged with being illegal residents who are not entitled to citizens' rights. People who've lived, worked, and made families here for several decades, and people now adult who were born and schooled here and who've been working and paying taxes as adults here have been and are being treated as illegal migrants by the Home Office strand of government, by the state which has openly declared that it is willfully making a hostile environment for these citizens. Catherine's right, this isn't new, but for them to be saying it explicitly, Theresa May to say that she designed it is extraordinary. Why are they doing this? Because some of their of our family members, friends, community members, they say, may be likely to have committed crimes. This stuff is obscene. So Caribbeans who've settled here, who no longer see themselves as migrants, are having to organize again, some more, against this new injustice. And what's more, this injustice is layered on already accumulated injustices. It's not as though when you come to the border, you have this nasty stuff. It's not as though when you first arrive, you get this, and then it goes away. What happens is more complicated, more complex. Injustices accumulate, and they result in thousands of disappointed and wasted young lives, failed and often excluded from the state's educational system. In young lives confused in and by their insecure means of making livelihood, that's to say they're jobless. In young lives obliged to invent ways to survive that can leave them open to be treated as criminals, and young lives hugely overrepresented in mental and penal institutions as a consequence. An organized Black Lives Matter movement, destined, I think, soon to become a Black and Brown Lives Matter movement, has been built in recent years, not only around concerns over Black deaths in custody, which is what kicks it off, but even more so about Black oppressed lives as they are actually lived. That's what Black Lives Matter should be about. And so today, the hostile environment envelops us all. That's what I'm trying to get to. Today, the movement for Black and Brown lives is joined with the Migrants Organize movement. Just look at the Grenfell fire. If I can just take another half minute out of my time, Akram. The Grenfell fire, I'm in North Kensington. Remember that, I've said this to people who don't know where I am. I'm in North Kensington. It's happened literally 200 or 300 yards away from my door out here. This awful disaster that killed people. Its investigation is going on now. As soon as it happened, we who lived here, who'd been community activists here, knew why it had happened. We knew that there'd been people who for years had been appealing to the local authority, asking them to please look after what was going on in these places, to be aware of the risks to people's lives. That local state is now being found, and will be found even more to be doing so, treated these people, these citizens, with contempt, as though it was not accountable to them, and so on. The result was the mass deaths of people in this situation. This is Grenfell. The people who were mainly living in that Grenfell situation, and in other Grenfell situations around the country, turn out to be fairly recent migrants, Black people, and so on. Okay, so I'm saying both. Thus, what I'm saying is an emergent movement for Black and Brown lives, and the Migrants Organize movement, the network that you're here to talk about, come together as part and parcel of a new set of networks that we are obliged to build in our militant communities of resistance today. We are obliged to build them. Therein lies our strength, in our communities. This is a necessary struggle. And this is a vital struggle, folks. Absolutely vital and urgent. I'll stop there, Akram.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Colin. That was bang on 20 minutes as well. Right, that we're doing quite well because we've got another 24 minutes still for questions. So I think if we can sort of get into some of the issues that are arising from the speeches. If you want to put any questions in the Q&A box, please make sure to do that. And I'm also told that I need to give a shout out to people to put their names and organizations in the chat just to say hi if you'd like to do that as well. So I think one of the questions that's come in is, it says, for Catherine and all of you, actually, it's shocking to learn that we are essentially fighting the same fight, but we don't know about our history. How can we do better? It's eye-opening to have this webinar, but I want to learn and read more. They don't teach this in our schools. And linked to that, how can we make sure that we record our current struggles for sharing and learning now in the future? I guess one of the things that, one of the reasons why I wanted to put on this seminar was because, you know, I'm Palestinian, someone who knows about colonial history, thought I was quite well read about what was happening here in Britain, but it's only when I came across the writings of Sivanandan, or I began to learn about the Grunwick strike, that I realized that this enormous history of migrant and Black struggle in Britain that we're very disconnected from. Whereas many parts of the struggle in the United States, for example, are the models that people often import and discuss and use here. So I think that's one part of the question. And the second part, perhaps, was picking up where you just left off, Colin, which was around this question of, well, we're talking about quite different forms today. And, you know, we've had the Black Lives Matter movement, this incredible growth in awareness and activism and organizing around racial justice and migration also, and the response to what they call the Windrush scandal. But actually, when we talk about mass organizations in the 70s and 80s, there was a different structure and organization in migrant and Black communities. So we're faced with, in parts of the history that are relevant, but quite different circumstances as well. So I wonder if either on the history or that second part of the question, anyone would like to come in.
I only have something small to say about the first one. On the last page of the thing I prepared to speak, I had a note that said, my homework for you, for those of you who come to it as a kind of study, my homework for you is, if you've not yet read Sivanandan's essay, From Resistance to Rebellion, you should do so. It contains all of the historical detail as well as the analysis that my presentation has pointed to. So for those who haven't done so, I think that's one of the big mapping out things that exists that talks about that deeper history in this place.
Catherine or Anita, did you have anything more to add?
I can add a couple of small things. So on the history and us not knowing it, and like I get that. I think it can often feel overwhelming because you know that there's all this stuff that's probably come before you, and there's been all these tiny but hugely impactful, like, you know, the strikes, movements, like challenges to an individual deportation campaign that are so important, and that like and it can feel overwhelming because we don't know everything, like, and we can't know everything. But I think that that's the importance of events like this. Like, this is a really important forum to talk about these things. I think that some of the, like Sivanandan's work, really important. Books like The Heart of Race, Black Women's Lives in Britain, you know, there are some texts that do offer these kind of historical and oral history approaches to understanding better the histories of racism, state violence and resistance in Britain. Something I would say as well in terms of how to remember what's going on today, like archiving is really important. It's a really important practice. I would definitely say for people who are organising today, that's a really important thing to be thinking about, like how you're being remembered and how you're being remembered on your own terms. Often archives get captured by big libraries like the British Library, and they get put in a shipping container somewhere out of London, and it's very hard to access or even know they exist. And the last thing I'll just say is that I think there's sometimes a generational problem of transmission and us not always hearing or getting told those stories. Something that Anitha said was like, the people who partook sometimes don't even realise, like, for them it was just like, yeah, an impulse, and that's an important thing to do. And I'm sure we've all done that, right? Like we've all been involved in strikes or organising, and like, you don't always think, oh, this is a great moment in history and like I need to tell my future generations, etc. So I mean, like, I don't think, I also think the state has a vested interest in us for not remembering. I think that when Theresa May announces a brand new hostile environment, like when actually like the wording of the NHS charges for migrant care are almost identical to the ones from 1982, I think the state has a vested interest in us not remembering our histories. And so I actually think it's an act of resistance for us to do so.
Yeah, can I add to that? And picking up on what you said, I think when I've given these talks in other places, people come back to me later and say, I went home and asked my parents what it was like when they first came here. I'd asked them about, and they say that there's a reluctance to talk about the struggles of that period. And particularly in my own research, I found it's been there in the case of the South Asian diaspora, and particularly the Gujarati migrants, the people I interviewed, many of them felt that they'd recovered their place, their class status, and middle class positions, and some of them were reluctant to talk about histories of struggle, of their time as working class, of their time on the margins. And I think it's really important that to talk to your, to your parents, talk about what it was like for them, what everyday life was like, because these stories often don't get told. Part of it might be that they're trying to protect you. Part of it might be they're trying to protect themselves from memories of difficult times. But it's through recovering those histories. And you're not going to hear it in schools. There's been, curriculum changes, notion of what Britishness is, and even the whole construction of what Black History Month is. None of that includes political struggles. None of that includes histories of resistance. So it's events like these. Those histories have to be sought out in your own families as well as beyond through events like this.
Akram, can I say something really small?
Yeah.
About this and about the other question that you talked about, Black Lives. Somebody was saying that we have these different times, there are different movements and so on. I think that the whole of what I'm saying and what we're talking about is saying the past and our past and our now are clearly connected. And the big thing that I think I've been trying to say, that all those words I use in my 20 minutes, I've just written down what I was trying to say, what I had to say. We have to take ourselves and our struggles seriously because we are history makers and we are nation changers. Okay, that's the point of what I was trying to say. We can describe all these things and we can get into it and we can talk about the difficulties and we can get resentful and so on, but actually we have to come to realize that we are history makers. This is what that whole long history is about, and we're vital nation changers. In another place I used a big word. I talked about civilizational change in Britain, which is what these new migrant struggles have brought here. Yeah. The notion of this being a multicultural society only arises because our struggles have placed that on the agenda, have made it very clear what is, all this stuff, which comes from the bottom. The leaders of our societies haven't been designing any of these moves for democratizing, for civilizing our culture. So take ourselves and our struggles seriously because we are history makers and we are nation changers.
Thank you so much, Colin, and everyone for your responses. I think there's a few questions now coming in on the Q&A, and unsurprisingly, Brexit is featuring prominently. So I'm just going to ask Sam's question, who asks, how can all the anti-racist groups join together to fight against the display of white English nationalism after Brexit? And is there a divide between British working class and non-white British working class? And I think, the first part of that question is also ties into some of the issues that many people on the call and ourselves have been discussing about how we build this movement together. And we've had a few advances. We had a day of action in October. We've had lots of different united campaigns that begin to connect really active community groups in different parts of the country. But it's about how we build this into something which has the scope and the capacity and the possibility of changing things in a more substantive way. So I guess, that's how we come together is one difficult question. and with this thing about white working class and non-white working class. I don't know if anyone wants to leap in on that.
That is the challenge of our times, I think. And that's what Brexit brought into the, into the public domain, this idea of dividing the working class and pitting the rights of white working class against other workers. And in some ways, often these other workers are the new migrants. And that's why, I mean, when, the whole referendum debate was happening, when the last election was happening, UKIP had certain token South Asians as members who were, branded about. And they were saying, okay, now that we've come in, we stop the rest coming in. And so it's always new migrants who are pitted as this other. And so within that idea of the white working class, there's a little bit of space for co-opting other non-white workers, so long as they're willing to then other newer categories of migrants. So there's this whole constant process that's going on in terms of to what extent will you be accepted, what are the limits of how we might accept you, and what are the terms on which you can be part of this imagination, perhaps on the border, so long as you carry out this othering of newer groups. And that's what Brexit was built upon. And I think that is, if I knew the answer to that, we wouldn't be here. We'd be doing something far more exciting in terms of actually, changing stuff. But yeah, we're doing it. We're here now because that's the biggest challenge we have. How do we see common cause across these divides that have been created recently? Part of it is through alliances like this. But yeah, I don't know.
Catherine or Colin, did you want to add anything?
After Catherine.
I don't have too much to add. I agree with everything that was just said by Anitha. I would say that the kind of political technology of seeking to divide the working class is not a new political technology. It's something that W.E.B. Du Bois was writing about well over 100 years ago when he wrote about the global colour line, when he talked about wages of whiteness. It's something that Sivanandan was writing about. So, and I think it kind of re-emerges at particular moments. It transforms itself. It re-encompasses new populations, like it will re-encompass some Hindu nationalists if that's what's productive, right, for its working. But ultimately what I see it as doing is functioning to secure the reproduction of racialized capitalism. And so, like, if we're talking about, okay, what are we going to do to push back against this? I would return to some of the people who've earlier theorized it, right? And think a bit the kind of politics of, okay, people are voting against their class interests, right? You've got people voting for Brexit who really are so harmed by Brexit that they're going to be food shortage. People are going to be materially harmed by the politics that they're voting for. And so I think there's a lot of community work that needs to be done to show that we have far more in common if we're organising collectively. But also that at the heart of that has to be an internationalist politics and an anti-nationalist politics that understands also our struggles here and our struggles against work and other things here as deeply connected to those elsewhere.
Thank you for both those. Thanks. I mean, I have nothing much to add either. It seems to me, my whole statement, again, I repeat, I came to this forum to try to say, yes, we have our heads down, we're making struggle, but let's think in a grander way about actually what we are, what we represent, where we're going, and how we ought to appreciate ourselves. So I'm saying, I'm repeating, we have to take on our present government. It's a very specific moment here. There are wicked people in Boris Johnson's government. It's up there, they are up to wicked undermining of all the clarity that Catherine and Anitha and the people have been managed to place on the agenda. They're up to it. You look at them, you can see them every day. They have their spokespeople, they come out with it. They're saying that all this racism we're talking about is imaginary stuff. I mean, we just have to change our heads and have a different attitude and we wouldn't see it like that. They're trying this kind of stuff. They are attempting to divide us again against ourselves. So we have to recognize that we have a ruling class, or the ruling classes, that make struggle too. It's not only we who are making struggle, they're always making struggle. And every time we make a particular move that exposes something, they make struggle to try to cover it over or divert it. We have to realize that this is where we are, and we have to be upping our fight back. That's all one can say. I mean, there's no thing you can invent that would sort it out. We just have to actually realize the predicament that we're in, realize what they're coming back with, realize how seriously urgent this cause is. And actually that becomes a part of how we do all the things we do. I'm speaking to you now with almost too much passion, because you're not the enemy in some kind of way, but actually it is that kind of energized militant passion, it seems to me, has got to come to characterize what we're doing. We must be serious. That's all. That's all I got to say.
Thanks so much, Colin. I think we've got 7 minutes left, and we've got one more question which came in. Which is kind of connecting to a point, the points that Catherine was making about the language that was used about the No Pass Laws campaign and the internationalism and the connection with that. And the question is, the far right is connected internationally from the US to India, in Israel and Brazil. So how do we connect our struggle against new manifestations of the far right who have a growing street presence in this country, but also connect that to the international struggle against these forces? And I guess that's particularly relevant in the work that we're doing, and what Colin was alluding to in terms of the sense of community being those who stand with you and those who join you in struggle. Whereas in many migrant communities, some of that's shifted. And now we have perhaps larger than before divisions along ideological lines, and where this anti-colonial, anti-racist history, principles, ethic has diminished to a certain degree. So I was wondering if anyone had wanted to comment on perhaps, rather not just being what is done to us from the British state, but also these international alliances and connections being part of what we have to contend with when we're thinking about progressive force in politics. I don't know if anyone has anything to chip in on that.
Part of what I think is going on is also a response to the very high levels of precarity across the world, and so the shift towards, it's an ideological shift, but it's also a response to material insecurity among the working class, white working class. And so the struggle to build alliances across racist divides has to be part of a broader struggle for rights. And I think it's only by bringing together those struggles that we can challenge what Catherine talked about. Was it seems to be counterintuitive to your material interests. So these, vote for Brexit, Trump, the rise of the right in Europe, and in a way, both of those struggles are connected, because it's about the insecurities with the current phase of capitalism, and in many ways that struggle is a global struggle, and so that a part of a problem is a lot of these struggles are happening parallel to each other. So there's struggle for workers' rights, which are at the national level, nature of the trade unions, and in particular sectors. And then and I think the question is, how do we bring those struggles together? Because the issues are interconnected. I don't have the answers. It's just about challenges, I'm afraid.
I think, Colin, you're on mute again.
I'm mute again. I'm so sorry. I'm so unused to these things. Hello, folks. I'm not going to give a big answer. I was just thinking of the question about looking at the right, thinking about the rise of the right and the international nature of that. And I want to wave a book at you. And it's a book by the director of the Institute of Race Relations. It's been out for about 2 years. It's not the last thing that she's written on it. This is Liz Fekete, is her name. It's been out for since 2018. So check the Institute's website, IRR News, and check this book, which is by Liz Fekete, which is called Europe's Fault Lines, Racism and the Rise of the Right. Liz Fekete. I can make this available to Migrants Organize the details if they want to put it on their to their people and so on. But that's just my first and immediate and quick response to that. There are people who've been looking at it. Liz has been looking at it for some time, here and across Europe. And in fact, Liz began, this is the first bit. If they're in your faces, you have to face them in the street. If you're trying to get a sense of how they are organizing internationally, then I'd suggest a look at Liz's book is not a bad place to start.
I'll just add one very small thing. So I think it's a really good question, because the far right and across colour lines is very connected globally, and resistance to it can't take place in a solely nationalist frame. But part of the question was, how do we counter it, or what do we do? And what I would say is there are already people doing it, right? So we can't erase what's already happening in the present. People who are indigenous populations who are fighting for their sovereignty and organising against settler colonial rule are connected to other, there are so many internationalist connections and ways that people are already learning from each other and already understanding that their conditions are structurally entwined, and that their fights are very similar, even if they're taking place against different regimes. So I would say, in response to the question, what do we do in the face of an connected far right? We learn from the connected anti-colonial far left.
Yeah, thanks everyone. That was a really fantastic talk, and I just wish it could go on for longer, but we have our time up, unfortunately. But really, this is part, as we said at the beginning, of a much wider discussion and part of a series of webinars that we want to run with this practical orientation about how it can inform and advance all the incredible work that you are all doing in different areas of the country. So if there are also different kinds of webinars or ideas you have, or events you think we could help run, then we're really happy to hear from you. You've got our contact details, presumably, or info@migrantsorganize.org. And we can, we're happy to discuss what other kind of webinars, hopefully events in person, we can do in the near future. But I'm going to hand over to Maimouna, who's going to sign us out of the event. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Akram.
Thanks, Akram, and a big thank you to all our speakers and everybody who joined us this evening. Just a reminder that tonight's seminar is the second of the Solidarity Knows No Borders webinar series. The third webinar is tentatively scheduled for March the 25th, and it is entitled Cases into Causes, Causes into a Movement. How can individual campaigns lead to collective justice and structural change? And just a little bit of info on that webinar. It will be focusing on individual campaigns which have long been a rallying cry for wider movements and structural change, highlighting the brutality of the British state, including in the immigration system. They are campaigns that demonstrate that individuals have the power to change the broader conditions around them and mobilize communities to build coalitions and to create change, some of which we've touched on today. As Sivanandan has said, individual campaigns can turn cases into issues, issues into causes, and causes into a movement. So we will learn how individual justice campaigns can highlight the effects of racist border controls, whilst also laying groundwork for wider movement building efforts. We will hear from campaigners as well as those directly affected, who will talk about how they set up their campaigns, how they tie them into the broader struggle for justice as well. So make sure you sign up to our mailing list. We will share a link on how to do so in the chat now. And yeah, thanks again to our speakers. It's really been a privilege to have you join us tonight. And we look forward to seeing you in March. Thank you, everyone.